A gunshot echoed through the warehouse before anyone saw who fired it, and the men inside scattered behind crates of stolen pharmaceuticals while shouting over each other about a Supe gone rogue 2 blocks away. Billy Butcher kicked open a side door with a shotgun already raised, scanning the shadows for capes, glowing eyes, or anything else that didn't belong in a normal fight. The air felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, heavy and quiet between the echoes, like the room had been waiting for him before he arrived. At the far end of the warehouse, under a flickering fluorescent light, a man in a white outfit stood calmly beside an overturned table, hands folded behind his back as if observing a lecture rather than a gunfight. Butcher didn't hesitate, leveling the shotgun and demanding to know which corporation had sent him, but the man simply smiled politely and asked, in a voice too calm for the moment, whether Butcher always entered rooms assuming he understood them. This is only the beginning, and worse is coming. If you think you can predict where this goes, you're already behind. Subscribe, because what follows isn't a fight you can follow with your eyes, but a trap you'll realize you walked into too late. The consequences of this meeting don't end here. The shotgun blast tore splinters from a wooden crate just inches from the man in white, scattering dust into the air that hung strangely still instead of drifting away. Billy Butcher didn't wait to see if the shot landed because hesitation around Supes usually meant ending up on the floor, so he racked the pump and stepped sideways for a clearer angle. The man hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, and hadn't even blinked at the noise, which was unsettling in a way Butcher couldn't immediately categorize. He stood there with his hands still behind his back, posture relaxed, eyes focused on Butcher with the patient interest of someone observing a predictable reaction rather than a threat. Butcher fired again, this time aiming for center mass, and the sound echoed through the warehouse with enough force to rattle loose sheet metal along the ceiling. The pellet struck the man's chest and seemed to pass through him without resistance, punching holes in a stack of boxes behind him instead. For a split second Butcher thought he'd missed, but the man's coat fluttered slightly from the impact that had never touched him. That was when Butcher felt the first thin thread of unease tighten in his stomach. The man tilted his head a fraction and spoke in a voice so calm it felt out of place in a room filled with gun smoke and shouted orders. He asked whether Butcher often opened conversations this way or if this was a special occasion. Butcher swore under his breath and stepped backward, recalculating the situation with the kind of fast paranoia that had kept him alive for years. This wasn't durability, wasn't speed, wasn't anything he recognized from Vought's usual circus of powers. Around them, Butcher's men were shouting from behind cover, asking if they should open fire too, but Butcher held up a hand without looking. Something about the man's stillness made him want quiet, made him want to think before adding more noise to the situation. The stranger took a small step forward, boots scraping lightly against the concrete, and Butcher immediately raised the shotgun again out of reflex. The man stopped as soon as the weapon came up, not out of fear but out of courtesy. He introduced himself as Sosuke Aizen, speaking the name as if it should mean something, though Butcher had never heard it before. There was no arrogance in the introduction, no demand for recognition, just polite acknowledgement like meeting someone at a social event. Butcher asked which Supe team he belonged to and which corporation had cooked him up, because that was the only framework he had for someone like this. Aizen's faint smile didn't change as he replied that he didn't work for anyone here. That answer irritated Butcher more than anything else could have. Supes always belonged to someone, even if they pretended not to, and this calm denial felt like a lie delivered without the usual tells. Butcher took a slow step to the side, trying to get a better angle on the man while keeping his distance, and noticed something that made his skin prickle. No matter where he moved, Aizen seemed to remain centered in his view, as if the room were subtly adjusting around him. One of Butcher's men finally lost patience and fired from behind a crate, a burst of gunfire that filled the warehouse with deafening noise. Butcher didn't look away from Aizen, watching closely for a reaction, but the bullets hit the back wall in a spray of sparks and debris. Aizen remained untouched, still standing exactly where he had been, expression unchanged, eyes focused gently on Butcher. The disconnect between what Butcher was hearing and what he was seeing made his thoughts stumble for half a second. Aizen asked calmly whether Butcher was finished, and the question landed with strange weight because it didn't sound mocking. It sounded like genuine curiosity about whether Butcher felt he had completed an expected sequence of actions. Butcher lowered the shotgun slightly, not out of trust, but because the situation had slipped into something he couldn't solve with force. He asked Aizen what he wanted, keeping his voice hard to mask the uncertainty creeping in. Aizen answered that he was simply observing, and that Butcher had made for an interesting first impression. He spoke as though Butcher were the subject of a study rather than a threat, nodding the way he moved, the way he chose targets, the way he hesitated before ordering his men to fire. Butcher bristled at that, feeling like he had just been described from the outside in a way that was uncomfortably accurate. He told Aizen to stop talking like he knew him. Aizen's smile widened slightly, not in amusement but in recognition. He said that Butcher's anger wasn't directed at him, and that made Butcher's grip tighten on the shotgun again. Because that part was true, and Butcher didn't like hearing it from a stranger. Around them, the warehouse felt quieter than it should have, the distant city noise oddly muffled as if the room itself were listening. Butcher finally did what he always did when a situation stopped making sense. He stepped forward instead of back. He closed the distance to within a few meters, staring Aizen directly in the eyes, searching for anything that looked like fear or deception. What he found instead was calm, polite attention, as if Aizen had been waiting for him to do exactly that. And without realizing it, Billy Butcher looked directly at the blade Aizen had drawn earlier, without remembering when it happened. Butcher didn't remember Aizen drawing a sword, and that realization sat in his mind like a misplaced object he couldn't account for. One moment the man's hands had been behind his back, and the next a polished blade was visible between them, angled slightly so the fluorescent lights caught along its edge. The reflection shimmered softly, almost beautifully, and for a fraction of a second Butcher's eyes lingered on it longer than they should have. Aizen noticed that pause without appearing to notice it at all. The warehouse felt tighter, the air heavier, as Butcher tried to retrace the last few seconds in his head and found a gap where memory should have been. He asked sharply when Aizen had pulled the weapon, and Aizen replied with gentle confusion, saying the sword had been in his hand the entire time. Butcher swore and glanced quickly toward his men for confirmation, but they were staring at Aizen with the same uncertain expressions, as if they too were struggling to recall something obvious. Aizen lowered the blade slightly, not in surrender but in reassurance, explaining in a tone that sounded almost educational that the sword's name was Kyoka Suigetsu. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain what that meant, just allowed the name to sit in the air like a clue offered too early. Butcher didn't care about the name, only about the way his thoughts felt slightly out of sync with what his eyes were telling him. One of Butcher's men stepped out from behind cover and shouted that Aizen hadn't moved at all since the first shot, insisting there had been no sword before. Butcher turned to him for a split second, and when he looked back, Aizen was standing a few steps closer than before. There had been no sound of movement, no scuff of boots on concrete, just a new position that Butcher couldn't account for. His pulse quickened in a way he hated because it felt like losing control of the room. Aizen apologized softly for the confusion and suggested they start over, as if this were a social misunderstanding rather than a standoff. He asked Butcher what he believed was happening here, and Butcher snapped that he believed Aizen was a Supe playing games. Aizen nodded thoughtfully and said that was a reasonable assumption given Butcher's experiences, which only irritated him more because it sounded so measured. The tension shifted when Butcher decided to change tactics and lowered the shotgun completely. He told his men to hold fire and stepped even closer, testing whether proximity would force a reaction. Aizen didn't move back, didn't raise the sword, just watched him with steady interest. Butcher realized he was being studied the way he studied Supes before deciding how to deal with them. He tried a different angle and asked who had sent Aizen here, mentioning Vought by name to watch for any flicker of recognition. Aizen's eyes remained calm as he replied that he had heard of Vought only after arriving in this world, which Butcher dismissed as nonsense. But the delivery was so even, so free of hesitation, that Butcher couldn't immediately tell if it was a lie. Behind them, one of the warehouse's emergency lights flickered and went out, plunging half the room into shadow. Butcher's eyes adjusted quickly, but something about the lighting felt wrong, like the shadows had shifted in a way that didn't match the fixtures above. He blinked hard once, trying to clear his vision, and when he looked again, Aizen seemed exactly where he had been. Aizen asked calmly whether Butcher always assumed he was the one in control of situations like this. The question wasn't mocking, it was curious, as if Aizen genuinely wanted to know the answer. Butcher opened his mouth to respond and realized he didn't have one ready, because control was something he usually felt, not something he articulated. Then Aizen said something that stopped him cold. He mentioned Becca. Butcher's grip tightened involuntarily, and his eyes hardened in an instant. He demanded to know how Aizen knew that name, because it wasn't something he shared casually, not even with allies. Aizen replied gently that Butcher had been thinking about her since he entered the warehouse, and that it had been visible in the way his attention moved across the room. That explanation didn't make sense, and that was the problem. Butcher knew how careful he was with his thoughts, how he compartmentalized memories to avoid exactly this kind of vulnerability. The fact that Aizen had reached directly into the one part of him he kept buried felt less like a guess and more like a precise strike. Aizen didn't press the advantage. He didn't threaten, didn't taunt. He simply observed that Butcher's hatred for Supe wasn't random, and that it had a very personal origin. The calmness of the delivery made it feel like a diagnosis rather than an accusation, and Butcher found himself more unsettled by that than he would have been by open hostility. Outside the warehouse, sirens began to approach, distant but growing louder, likely drawn by the earlier gunfire. Butcher barely registered the sound because his focus had narrowed entirely to the man in front of him. Aizen glanced toward the entrance briefly, then back at Butcher, as if the arriving authorities were a minor inconvenience to an ongoing conversation. He suggested they leave together before the police complicated things, saying it in the same tone someone might use to propose stepping outside for fresh air. Butcher almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound caught in his throat because part of him was already considering it. That was when he realized the confrontation had shifted from weapons to something far more uncomfortable. He wasn't trying to figure out how to stop Aizen anymore. He was trying to figure out what Aizen wanted from him. The sirens outside grew louder, layering over each other until the warehouse walls seemed to vibrate with approaching authority. Blue and red lights flashed through broken windows, scattering color across the concrete floor in restless patterns that made the room feel even more unstable. Butcher's men looked toward the exits, waiting for an order that didn't come, because their attention kept drifting back to Aizen as if he were the real variable that needed solving. Aizen stood calmly amid the noise, posture unchanged, eyes resting on Butcher with patient interest. Butcher finally gestured toward a side door and told his crew to clear out the back, his voice sharp and efficient as always. They hesitated for half a second, glancing at Aizen again, then obeyed without argument because Butcher's authority still held even in confusion. Aizen watched them go without comment, as if their departure had been expected from the beginning. When the last of them slipped into the alley, the warehouse felt strangely intimate despite the chaos outside. Butcher turned back to Aizen and told him they were leaving before the police turned this into paperwork neither of them wanted. Aizen nodded politely and followed him toward the exit without asking where they were going, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need the details. They stepped into the alley just as squad cars screeched into the front lot, officers shouting commands into the warehouse they had already abandoned. Butcher led the way through narrow back streets, and Aizen kept pace effortlessly, never rushing, never lagging. By the time they reached Butcher's car several blocks away, The sirens had blended into distant background noise. Butcher unlocked the door, paused, and looked at Aizen as if expecting him to ask where they were headed. Aizen simply waited with a faint, courteous smile that made the silence feel deliberate. Butcher swore under his breath and got into the driver's seat, gesturing for Aizen to take the passenger side. As they pulled into traffic, Butcher's mind raced ahead to the only framework he had for situations like this. If Aizen was Vought, then Vought would want to know about him. If Aizen was a Supe, then someone somewhere had a file, a record, a corporate tag. Butcher pulled out his phone at a red light and sent a coded message to his contacts, asking for anything on a new player matching Aizen's description. He didn't notice that Aizen was watching the screen with mild interest. Inside Vought Tower, analysts were already replaying fragments of footage pulled from nearby traffic cameras and warehouse security feeds. A man in white appearing in multiple frames without clear continuity had caught someone's attention, and the clips were forwarded up the chain quickly. Executives leaned over screens, trying to match the face against known rosters, archived experiments, and off-book projects. No one found anything. A call was placed to a familiar office, and within minutes Homelander was watching the same footage in silence. He leaned closer to the screen as the video showed Butcher walking out of the warehouse with Aizen beside him, their movements oddly synchronized. Homelander didn't recognize the man, but something about the way he carried himself felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. He told Vought to keep digging and to inform him the moment they had a name. Back in the car, Butcher's phone buzzed with replies that all said the same thing. Nothing. No matches, no records, no rumors, no corporate whispers. That absence of information bothered him more than finding something would have. He glanced sideways at Aizen, who sat with hands folded calmly in his lap, looking out the window at passing streetlights like a tourist observing a new city. Butcher asked directly where Aizen had come from, deciding bluntness was the fastest route to clarity. Aizen replied that he had arrived recently and was still learning how this world organized itself, which sounded like nonsense but was delivered so plainly that Butcher couldn't immediately dismantle it. He pressed further, asking if Aizen had ever heard of Compound V, and Aizen shook his head slightly as if considering the term for the first time. They drove in silence for several minutes, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Butcher felt a strange pressure in his thoughts, like he was trying to recall something important that kept slipping just out of reach. He replayed the warehouse encounter in his mind and found small inconsistencies he couldn't resolve, like frames missing from a film reel. Every time he tried to focus on them, the memory seemed to blur. Aizen broke the silence by asking where they were going, his tone polite and genuinely curious. Butcher answered that they were heading somewhere safe to talk, and only afterward realized he had phrased it as if Aizen were a guest rather than a detainee. The subtle shift in wording bothered him, but he couldn't pinpoint why. Aizen nodded once, as if that outcome had always been obvious. Behind the scenes, Vought's response escalated quietly. Surveillance was redirected, facial recognition systems were pushed beyond normal limits, and field teams were instructed to keep eyes on Butcher's known locations. The idea that Butcher had willingly walked away with an unidentified Supe set off alarms that no one could ignore. They didn't know yet that the man with him had already stepped into the center of their operations without anyone noticing. As Butcher turned onto a dark side street leading to one of his safe houses, he felt the uncomfortable sense that this situation had stopped being something he was managing. He told himself he was bringing Aizen in to study him, to figure out what kind of threat he was dealing with. The thought settled into place just easily enough that he didn't question it. Aizen looked ahead at the dim building coming into view and smiled faintly. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected. The safe house sat above a shuttered storefront that had been abandoned long enough for the street to forget it existed, which was exactly why Butcher liked it. He parked a block away out of habit and led Aizen through a narrow alley to a metal staircase that groaned softly under their weight. The city noise felt distant here, muffled by brick walls and the late hour, and for a moment the situation almost felt manageable again. Butcher unlocked the door, stepped inside, and gestured for Aizen to enter first so he could watch him. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp near a cluttered table covered in maps, burner phones, and scribbled notes. Aizen took in the space with calm curiosity, eyes lingering on the details like he was learning something important without needing to ask. Butcher closed the door behind them and locked it twice, then stood with his back to it as if bracing for something he couldn't name. The tension in the room felt different from the warehouse, quieter but somehow heavier. Butcher began talking immediately, partly to assert control and partly to fill the silence that Aizen never seemed eager to break. He explained who he was, what Vought was, and why Supes were a problem that needed solving, framing the world in the only terms that made sense to him. Aizen listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally in acknowledgement rather than agreement. The more Butcher spoke, the more it felt like he was justifying himself to someone who hadn't asked for an explanation. Aizen asked a simple question that cut through the speech cleanly. He wanted to know why Butcher believed all Supes were the same when his hatred clearly came from a specific source. The question landed harder than Butcher expected because it sounded reasonable, not confrontational. He replied sharply that experience had taught him not to make exceptions. Aizen didn't argue. He simply asked whether Butcher had ever considered that Vought benefited from him thinking that way. That thought slipped into Butcher's mind too easily, sliding past his defenses before he could reject it. He opened his mouth to counter it and found himself hesitating for the first time in the conversation. Across the city, Vought surveillance teams were tracking Butcher's vehicle movements and triangulating likely safe-house locations. Orders were sent to field agents to quietly observe rather than engage, because the unknown Supe with him had already proven difficult to categorize. Homelander stood in a conference room watching a live map update in real time, jaw tight as he followed the blinking signal that marked Butcher's last known position. He didn't like not knowing who this new player was, and he liked even less that Butcher had reached him first. Back in the safe house, Butcher poured 2 glasses of cheap whiskey without asking if Aizen wanted one. Aizen accepted it politely and held the glass without drinking, studying the amber liquid as if it were part of the environment rather than a beverage. Butcher drank his in a single swallow and leaned against the table, trying to decide how to turn this conversation back into something he controlled. The problem was that Aizen wasn't resisting anything, which made it hard to push against him. Aizen asked about Homelander next, and the name made Butcher's expression harden instantly. He spoke about Homelander with a mixture of anger and disgust that he didn't try to hide, describing him as the worst product Vought had ever created. Aizen listened closely, eyes attentive, as if this were the detail he had been waiting for. He didn't offer an opinion, only absorbed the information quietly. What Butcher didn't notice was how the conversation kept circling back to his own motivations rather than Aizen's. Every time he tried to ask about Aizen's past, the topic seemed to drift gently back to Vought, Becca, Homelander, and the things that had shaped Butcher's life. It didn't feel forced. It felt like the natural flow of discussion. That subtle shift was happening so smoothly that Butcher never recognized it as guidance. Outside the building, 2 Vought surveillance vehicles parked at opposite ends of the block, engines idling quietly as agents watched the entrance through tinted glass. They reported no visible movement inside, no unusual energy readings, nothing that suggested immediate danger. The calmness of the situation made them more nervous than open conflict would have. Inside, Aizen finally took a small sip of the whiskey and commented that Butcher had built his entire life around fighting a system that understood him very well. Butcher bristled at that, asking what that was supposed to mean. Aizen replied gently that Vought likely predicted most of Butcher's actions before he made them, which was why he was still alive. That thought struck deeper than Butcher wanted to admit. He had always believed he was unpredictable, a problem Vought couldn't fully contain. The idea that he might be operating within boundaries they had already mapped out unsettled him in a way gunfire never could. He poured himself another drink without realizing his hand was shaking slightly. Aizen watched this quietly, not pressing further, allowing the idea to settle on its own. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if something invisible had shifted into place. Butcher rubbed his eyes briefly, trying to clear a growing sense that the ground under his assumptions was less stable than he had believed. Neither of them noticed the faint red dot of a distant camera, lens watching through a crack in the blinds. The street outside the safe house remained quiet in the way that only carefully monitored places ever are, with engines idling at both ends of the block and agents pretending to be invisible behind dark glass. Inside their vehicles, Vought operatives spoke in low voices into secure channels, reporting that Butcher had not left the building and that no additional movement had been detected. The stillness unsettled them because they were used to tracking Butcher as a problem in motion, not as a fixed point. Orders came down to maintain distance and wait for further instruction from higher up. In Vought Tower, analysts had reconstructed the warehouse encounter frame by frame, trying to understand why bullets seemed to pass through the unidentified man without effect. Every angle produced the same result. No clear evidence of speed, no visible barrier, no distortion that could be labeled as a known ability. The footage made less sense the longer they studied it. A meeting was called that included executives, legal advisors, and a familiar presence who watched silently from the back of the room. Homelander leaned against the wall with his arms folded, eyes narrowed at the paused image of Aizen standing calmly in the warehouse. He didn't like the way the man held himself, the absence of visible tension in a situation that should have demanded it. Something about the posture felt unnatural, like watching someone who wasn't reacting to the world the way everyone else did. He told Vought he wanted eyes inside that building, not just on the street. Back in the safe house, Butcher paced slowly across the room while Aizen sat calmly at the table, hands folded, watching him with patient attention. Butcher had been talking for several minutes without realizing he was circling the same points again and again, describing Vought's patterns, their media control, their manipulation of public perception. The more he spoke, the more the conversation felt like he was outlining the problem for someone who already understood it. Aizen nodded occasionally, asking small clarifying questions that kept Butcher talking. A soft knock at the door interrupted them, 3 slow taps that carried through the quiet room. Butcher froze instantly, shotgun in hand before he was even fully aware of reaching for it. No one knew this location except his inner circle, and none of them would show up unannounced. He glanced at Aizen, who remained seated, expression unchanged, as if the knock had been expected. Butcher moved silently toward the door and checked the peephole, seeing a plainclothes officer standing on the landing with a neutral expression. That alone set off alarms in his mind because police didn't find this place without a reason. He opened the door a fraction, keeping the chain in place, and asked what the problem was. The officer spoke calmly, asking if Billy Butcher was inside and saying they just wanted to ask a few questions about a disturbance earlier that night. Butcher denied everything automatically, preparing to shut the door, when the officer's eyes flicked past him into the room. His gaze settled on Aizen, and his expression shifted subtly into something like recognition. He greeted Aizen politely by name. Butcher's head snapped back toward the table, confusion cutting through his thoughts. He hadn't given Aizen's name to anyone, not over the phone, not in messages, not out loud except inside this room. Aizen met his eyes with the same calm look as before, offering no explanation. The officer outside continued speaking, saying that Mr. Aizen had already spoken with authorities earlier and that they just needed a brief follow-up. Butcher felt the floor drop out from under his assumptions. He stepped back from the door slowly, looking between the officer and Aizen, trying to reconcile 2 realities that didn't match. Aizen stood up smoothly and walked toward the entrance with unhurried steps, as if this were a scheduled appointment. Butcher grabbed his arm instinctively to stop him, but Aizen paused and looked at him with gentle curiosity rather than resistance. The officer outside waited patiently, not pressing, not suspicious, just expectant. Butcher demanded to know when Aizen had spoken to the police, and Aizen replied calmly that it had been earlier in the evening after the warehouse incident. That memory didn't exist in Butcher's mind, and the absence of it felt like a hole he could fall into. He opened the door fully, trying to take control of the situation through confrontation. The officer greeted Aizen warmly and confirmed details about the warehouse disturbance that matched events Butcher remembered, except for the parts where Aizen had apparently cooperated with authorities. The conversation flowed naturally between them, with Aizen answering questions that Butcher didn't remember him being asked. Behind the officer, one of the Vought surveillance cars rolled slowly past the end of the street, its occupants watching the interaction through cameras. They noted that Aizen appeared relaxed, cooperative, and entirely unthreatening, which conflicted sharply with the warehouse footage they had been analyzing. The contradiction made the situation harder to classify rather than easier. Butcher stood there listening, feeling like he had stepped into the middle of a story he hadn't been present for. The officer thanked Aizen politely and said they might be in touch again if needed, then nodded at Butcher and left without suspicion. The footsteps faded down the staircase, leaving the room heavy with silence once more. Butcher closed the door slowly and turned toward Aizen, his thoughts racing in tight circles. He asked, in a voice that had lost its usual certainty, what exactly had just happened. Aizen replied gently that sometimes people remembered events differently depending on what they expected to see. That answer didn't clarify anything. It made everything worse. Butcher stood in the center of the safe house for several long seconds after the officer's footsteps faded, staring at the closed door as if it might reopen and explain itself. The room felt subtly rearranged, not physically but mentally, like furniture he knew by heart had been moved a few inches in the dark. He tried to replay the evening in his mind from the warehouse onward, and kept finding soft gaps where memory should have been continuous. Each time he focused on one of those gaps, the memory around it seemed to blur and lose detail. Aizen returned to his seat at the table as though nothing unusual had happened, folding his hands neatly and waiting. There was no tension in his posture, no sign that he had just participated in something that had shaken Butcher's sense of reality. Butcher paced once across the room, then back again, rubbing his temples in frustration he didn't try to hide. He told himself this was a trick, some kind of Supe ability designed to confuse perception, and that identifying it would restore control. Across the city, Vought surveillance teams reported the interaction with the police officer to headquarters, noting how ordinary and uneventful it had appeared. The report confused executives more than any violent confrontation would have, because it suggested the unknown man was cooperating with authorities rather than avoiding them. A new directive went out to quietly involve federal agencies under the pretense of identifying a potential new asset rather than a threat. The language of the response had shifted without anyone openly acknowledging why. In a conference room high above the city, Homelander watched a replay of the officer greeting Aizen by name. He didn't like the casual familiarity in the exchange, nor the way Butcher had stood there looking uncertain. Homelander had spent years studying Butcher's behavior and knew how rarely that man hesitated. Seeing it now, even through grainy footage, unsettled him more than the unknown Supe's presence itself. Back in the safe house, Butcher finally stopped packing and leaned both hands on the table, staring directly at Aizen. He demanded a straight answer about what kind of ability he was using, voice low and intense. Aizen didn't deny anything, but he didn't confirm it either. He simply asked whether Butcher believed his own eyes or his own memory more. That question struck deeper than Butcher wanted to admit because, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure. He thought back to the warehouse, to the bullets passing through Aizen, to the sword he didn't remember seeing drawn. The more he tried to isolate those moments, the more they felt like impressions rather than solid events. It was like trying to remember a dream in full daylight. Aizen observed this quietly, noting how Butcher's certainty eroded not through confrontation, but through self-examination. He asked if Butcher had ever considered how often Vought might already be shaping what he believed to be real. The idea slipped into place so easily that Butcher didn't immediately reject it, and that disturbed him more than anything else. Outside, a low hum filled the air as a surveillance drone repositioned above the block, its camera feeding live footage to both Vought and federal agencies now involved in the situation. Analysts watched Aizen and Butcher through thermal imaging and audio pickups, trying to interpret a conversation that didn't appear hostile but felt significant. The calmness of the exchange made decision-makers nervous because they couldn't predict where it would lead. Butcher poured another drink and didn't notice that he hadn't asked Aizen if he wanted one this time. He swallowed half the glass in a single motion, trying to drown the creeping sense that he was losing control of the narrative he relied on. Aizen watched him with the same patient attention as before, offering no resistance, no pressure, just presence. Then Butcher's phone buzzed with a secure call from one of his contacts inside a federal task force. The voice on the line told him that Vought had officially flagged Aizen as a cooperative individual assisting with an ongoing investigation. Butcher froze, asking what the hell they were talking about, because he had never shared Aizen's name or location with anyone outside this room. The voice insisted the report had come in hours ago. Butcher lowered the phone slowly and looked at Aizen, who met his gaze with gentle curiosity. The timeline in Butcher's head no longer aligned with the information he was receiving from outside sources. It felt like trying to force two mismatched puzzle pieces together. Aizen suggested softly that perhaps events were unfolding in ways Butcher hadn't noticed yet. The realization that he might be behind his own situation, rather than ahead of it, settled into Butcher's mind with uncomfortable weight. Morning light crept through the blinds in thin, uneven stripes that cut across the safe-house table and over the scattered notes Butcher had left there days ago. Neither man had slept, though only one of them looked like it mattered. Butcher's eyes were bloodshot, jaw tight from hours of thinking in circles, while Aizen sat exactly as he had for most of the night, posture relaxed, expression composed, as if time passed differently for him. The room felt less like a hiding place now, and more like a quiet observation chamber. Butcher tried to reassert control by doing what he always did when things felt uncertain. He called in the boys. One by one, they arrived in staggered intervals, slipping into the building through the back stairs with the usual caution. Huey Campbell entered first, eyes immediately locking onto Aizen with nervous curiosity, followed by Mother's Milk and Frenchie, each reacting in their own quiet way to the unfamiliar presence. Butcher didn't introduce Aizen as a threat. He introduced him as someone they needed to understand. That subtle choice of words slipped past everyone without comment, including Butcher himself. Aizen greeted each of them politely by name before Butcher had the chance to do it, offering a slight nod as if meeting acquaintances rather than strangers. Huey hesitated, glancing at Butcher for confirmation, but Butcher said nothing because he was still processing how Aizen knew those names. Frenchie whispered something under his breath in French about unsettling vibes, and Mother's Milk kept his eyes fixed on Aizen with measured suspicion. The room filled with overlapping questions as the boys tried to piece together who this man was and why Butcher had brought him here. Butcher attempted to explain the warehouse encounter, but as he spoke, he realized how inconsistent it sounded out loud. The details felt slippery, and he found himself simplifying events just to make them coherent. Aizen listened quietly, letting Butcher shape the narrative without correction. Huey asked the obvious question, was Aizen a Supe? Butcher answered before Aizen could, saying he didn't think so, though he couldn't explain why. That answer surprised even him, because it contradicted his first instinct from the night before. Aizen's faint smile didn't change as he watched the conversation evolve exactly as expected. Outside the building, Vought surveillance vehicles rotated shifts while federal agents joined the watch, their presence disguised as routine patrols. The situation had grown large enough that multiple agencies were now involved, each trying to understand the significance of the unknown man inside that safe house. None of them realized that the conversation happening in that small room mattered more than any surveillance feed. Inside, Mother's Milk asked Aizen directly what he wanted, voice calm but firm. Aizen answered that he was simply observing how this world worked, and that Butcher had proven to be a particularly informative guide. The phrasing sounded harmless, almost flattering, and it diffused tension instead of raising it. Butcher didn't notice that the question had shifted from suspicion to participation. Frenchie circled behind Aizen slightly, trying to observe him from another angle as if looking for hidden tells. He frowned after a moment and admitted quietly that he couldn't get a read on him at all, which unsettled him more than if he had sensed danger. Huey asked if they should be worried, and Butcher hesitated before answering. That hesitation was the real change. Aizen watched the group dynamic carefully, noting how they deferred to Butcher for cues even when he didn't provide them. He asked Huey how long he had been working with Butcher, and the question flowed naturally into a discussion about their past encounters with Vought. The conversation drifted away from Aizen entirely and into shared memories of trauma and anger. Butcher realized too late that the focus of the room had shifted again. He had intended for the boys to analyze Aizen, but instead they were opening up in front of him without resistance. The pattern from the night before was repeating itself, but now with more people involved. Aizen wasn't pushing the conversation. He was guiding it with small, almost invisible questions that kept everyone talking. Huey laughed nervously at one point, commenting that it felt like a therapy session rather than a briefing. Aizen nodded thoughtfully, saying that people often revealed the most when they believed they were just talking casually. No one recognized that as a statement of intent. Butcher leaned back in his chair, watching the group, feeling a strange mix of familiarity and distance at the same time. He was still in the room, still leading, but the direction of the conversation no longer felt like his. Aizen sat quietly at the center of it all, calm and attentive, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the moment they met. Outside, Homelander stood on a nearby rooftop, watching the building from a distance with narrowed eyes. He didn't know why he felt compelled to be there personally instead of relying on reports, but something about this situation refused to feel routine. He could sense that something was happening inside that he couldn't see. And for the first time in a long while, that bothered him. By midday, the safe house no longer felt like a hideout, and more like a quiet meeting room where something subtle but important was unfolding without anyone nomming it. Coffee cups had replaced whiskey glasses, and the boys sat around the table with the wary fatigue of people who had talked more than they intended. Aizen remained composed at the center of the room, listening with polite interest as if he had all the time in the world. Butcher watched the group with growing discomfort he couldn't fully explain. The shift happened when Mother's Milk finally voiced what had been bothering him since he arrived. He said it felt like they were discussing their lives in front of someone they didn't know, and that didn't sit right. The statement broke the conversational rhythm, and for a moment everyone looked at Aizen again with renewed caution. Aizen acknowledged the concern calmly and said that trust was always difficult in unfamiliar company. Butcher seized on that pause as an opportunity to regain control, suggesting they take a break and regroup. Huey stood up first, rubbing his eyes, and Frenchie moved toward the window to check the street below. Mother's Milk remained seated, watching Aizen closely as if trying to solve a puzzle that kept rearranging itself. The room's atmosphere tightened, no longer casual, no longer drifting. Outside, the surveillance vehicles had been replaced by a larger presence. Unmarked federal vans now lined the block, and agents communicated through quiet headsets while pretending to conduct routine operations. Vought had escalated the situation, by involving higher authorities under the claim that a potentially unstable Supe was being sheltered by known vigilantes. The narrative was forming without Butcher knowing it existed. Homelander remained on the rooftop across the street, watching through tinted windows with a focus that had sharpened over the past hour. He didn't understand what he was sensing, but he knew this wasn't normal. The building didn't feel like a threat, but it didn't feel safe either. He had the uncomfortable sense that something inside was operating outside his understanding. Inside the safe house, Butcher turned back to Aizen and asked directly whether he was manipulating them. The bluntness of the question cut through the air like a blade. Aizen didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. He simply asked Butcher what he believed manipulation looked like. That response frustrated Butcher because it turned the accusation into a philosophical question rather than a factual one. Before Butcher could answer, the front door downstairs exploded inward with a thunderous crash that shook the entire building. Shouts echoed up the stairwell as armed agents flooded the lower floor, boots pounding on wood and metal. Huey swore loudly, and Frenchie moved instinctively toward his bag of equipment. Mother's Milk grabbed Butcher's shoulder, asking if this had been a setup. Butcher's mind raced, trying to piece together how their location had been compromised so quickly. He looked at Aizen with a mixture of suspicion and confusion, expecting some sign of alarm. Aizen remained seated, calm as ever, as if this development had been anticipated long ago. Agents stormed the upper level seconds later, weapons raised, shouting for everyone to get on the ground. Butcher reached for his gun out of reflex, but Aizen raised a hand slightly, not to stop him physically but to draw his attention. The gesture was small, almost casual, yet Butcher found himself hesitating without understanding why. One of the agents stepped forward and addressed Aizen by name again, speaking with the same respectful tone as the officer earlier. He asked if everything was all right and if Aizen required assistance. The room went still as the boys looked from the agent to Aizen and back again, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Aizen stood slowly and assured the agent that everything was fine, that these men were acquaintances and meant no harm. The agent nodded immediately, lowering his weapon and signaling the others to stand down. Butcher stared in disbelief as the entire tactical posture of the room dissolved into calm professionalism. Huey whispered that this didn't make any sense. Frenchie muttered something about reality feeling thin. Mother's Milk's eyes narrowed as he watched the interaction unfold with growing suspicion. Butcher felt like he was watching a script he hadn't been given. The agents apologized for the intrusion and began filing back down the stairs as quickly as they had arrived. Within a minute, the building was quiet again, leaving only the echo of boots and the lingering confusion in the room. No one spoke for several seconds. Butcher turned to Aizen slowly and asked, in a voice that had lost all certainty, "What the hell are you?" Aizen met his gaze with the same calm, polite expression he had worn since the warehouse, and smiled. The silence after the agents left did not feel like relief. It felt like the moment after a card trick when you realize you never saw the hands move. The boys stood scattered around the room, weapons half lowered, trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they believed about authority, Vought, and themselves. Butcher remained near the table, staring at Aizen with a look that had shifted from suspicion to something closer to unease. Aizen adjusted the sleeve of his coat slightly, as if nothing of importance had happened. Huey was the first to speak, his voice tight with confusion as he asked why federal agents were treating Aizen like a colleague instead of a target. Mother's Milk echoed the concern, saying this felt less like coincidence and more like orchestration. Frenchie paced slowly near the window, muttering that reality itself seemed to be bending in small ways he couldn't explain. Butcher listened to them, but his eyes never left Aizen. Across the street, Homelander watched the agents exit the building without resistance and felt a quiet frustration he couldn't identify. He had expected confrontation, chaos, something he could respond to with strength or intimidation. Instead, He saw calm cooperation that made no sense. The lack of visible conflict made him feel strangely excluded from whatever was happening inside. Inside the safe house, Butcher finally demanded a straight answer, not about powers or affiliations, but about intent. He asked Aizen what he was trying to accomplish by inserting himself into their lives so quietly. Aizen answered in the same gentle tone as always, saying he was simply observing how systems functioned when left to their own momentum. The phrasing sounded harmless, but it carried an implication that unsettled everyone in the room. Butcher's phone buzzed with an alert that pulled his attention away for just a moment. News feeds were lighting up with reports that Vought had announced a new cooperative initiative with federal agencies to monitor emerging threats. The statement included a brief mention of a consultant named Sosuke Aizen, who had assisted in de-escalating a situation earlier that morning. Butcher's stomach dropped as he read the words twice, trying to understand how a narrative had formed around events he didn't remember happening. He showed the screen to the boys, who reacted with disbelief and growing alarm. Huey asked how Aizen could already be part of an official statement when they had only met him hours ago. Frenchie whispered that this felt like time itself had skipped ahead without them. Mother's Milk looked at Butcher and asked quietly whether he was sure he had brought Aizen here on his own. That question hit harder than anything else. Butcher opened his mouth to answer and found himself hesitating, because the certainty he had felt about the previous night was no longer as solid as he wanted it to be. He remembered the warehouse, the gunshots, the alley, but the sequence between those moments felt increasingly fragile. Aizen watched this realization unfold without interrupting. Outside, Homelander received the same news alert and frowned as he read Aizen's name in an official Vought release. He had not approved this, had not been informed, and yet it was happening. For the first time in a long while, he felt like events were moving without his knowledge. He took off from the rooftop in a blur, heading straight for Vought Tower to demand answers. Back in the safe house, Butcher looked at Aizen with an expression that had lost its edge. He asked quietly whether any of this had been real in the way he thought it was. Aizen didn't answer directly. He asked instead whether Butcher believed reality was defined by events or by perception of those events. The room felt smaller. Huey backed up a step, whispering that he didn't like where this was going. Frenchie nodded, eyes darting between Butcher and Aizen. Mother's Milk remained still, watching Butcher more than Aizen now, as if realizing the real struggle wasn't external. Butcher's hands tightened into fists as he tried to anchor himself to something solid. He thought about Becca, about Homelander, about every reason he had for fighting Vought. Those memories still felt real, still felt painful, but now he couldn't shake the creeping fear that even those might be subject to the same subtle distortion. Aizen stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking out at the city with quiet interest. He spoke softly about how predictable systems become once you understand what drives the people inside them. His words didn't accuse or threaten, they described. That made them harder to resist. Butcher realized with a cold clarity that he was no longer trying to outmaneuver Aizen. He was trying to confirm that he had ever been in control at all. The room had grown so quiet that even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner sounded loud enough to be intrusive. No one spoke for several long seconds after Aizen's last words, because each of them was trying to hold onto their own version of what had happened since the warehouse. Butcher felt like he was standing on a surface that looked solid but shifted slightly every time he put weight on it. Aizen remained by the window, watching the street below as if the conversation behind him were already resolved. Huey finally broke the silence by asking Butcher what they were supposed to do now. It was a simple question, but it carried an unfamiliar weight because Butcher didn't have an immediate answer. Normally, he would bark an order, form a plan, move forward without hesitation. This time, he hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. Mother's Milk watched that hesitation carefully, and something in his expression changed from concern to realization. He asked Butcher quietly whether this situation reminded him of anything, whether it felt similar to the way Vought manipulated public narratives. The comparison hit Butcher hard because it reframed the problem in terms he understood all too well. Frenchie moved toward the door, saying they needed air, needed distance from whatever this was. But as he reached for the handle, he paused, frowning slightly. He turned back and asked Butcher if they had come here straight from the warehouse or if they had stopped somewhere first. Butcher opened his mouth to answer and found his memory stumbling again. He remembered driving. He remembered talking. He did not remember the streets between. That gap widened in his mind like a crack spreading through glass. Aizen turned from the window and walked back to the table, not hurried, not pressing, simply returning to the center of the room. He observed gently that memory often fills in blanks with what feels logical rather than what is accurate. The comment landed with uncomfortable familiarity because Butcher had seen that exact tactic used by Vought's media teams for years. Butcher reached for his phone, intending to check the GPS logs to anchor himself to something verifiable. When he opened the map history, he saw a route that didn't match what he remembered at all. The path showed several stops across the city, including a brief visit to a government building he had never entered in his recollection. Huey leaned over his shoulder and swore softly. Mother's Milk stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the screen, trying to reconcile the data with their shared memory. Frenchie shook his head, whispering that this felt like waking up in the middle of a story that had already been written. None of them could explain how physical evidence contradicted what they believed had happened. Aizen didn't gloat or explain. He simply watched the realization spread across their faces as if observing a predictable reaction. He asked Butcher calmly whether he still believed he had brought Aizen here of his own free will. That question cut deeper than any accusation could have. Butcher felt something inside him give way, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet understanding that his certainty had been an illusion. He had always believed he was the one manipulating situations, staying ahead of Vought by refusing to play their game. Now he was confronted with the possibility that he had been guided gently, invisibly, into every step since the warehouse. The loss wasn't physical. It was the loss of trust in his own perception. Outside, news vans had begun parking at the end of the street, reporters sensing that something important was happening without knowing what. Cameras pointed toward the building, as if expecting a confrontation that never came. Inside, the real collapse was happening quietly in Butcher's mind. He looked at Aizen and asked, in a voice that no longer carried anger, whether any of this had ever been under his control. Aizen met his gaze with the same calm expression and replied that people often mistake freedom of action for freedom of outcome. That was when Butcher understood what he had lost. Not a fight, not an ally, but the certainty that his choices had ever truly been his. The safe house no longer felt like a place where plans were made. It felt like a place where plans had already unfolded without anyone realizing it. The boys stood in a loose circle around the table, each of them processing the same quiet shock in different ways. Butcher remained still, staring at the phone in his hand as if it had betrayed him personally. Aizen sat calmly in his chair again, posture unchanged, observing the room with gentle attentiveness. Outside, the presence on the street had grown. News vans idled at the corner, federal vehicles lined both sides of the block, and curious onlookers had begun gathering behind police tape that had appeared without anyone remembering when it was set up. The building had become the center of attention without a single dramatic event drawing that attention there. Homelander hovered above the street now, visible to cameras and civilians alike, scanning the windows with an expression that had shifted from annoyance to quiet suspicion. Inside, Huey asked the question none of them wanted to voice. He wondered aloud if Aizen had been with them longer than they realized. The thought landed like a weight on the room, because it fit too neatly with everything else that didn't make sense. Frenchie shook his head slowly, saying he felt like he was remembering events that hadn't happened yet. Butcher looked at Aizen again, no longer as an enemy or an ally, but as a fixed point in a situation that kept shifting around him. He asked how long Aizen had been guiding things without them noticing. Aizen answered softly that guidance often goes unseen when it aligns with what people already want to do. That explanation was worse than any confession, because it meant none of them had been forced into anything. They had simply followed paths that felt natural, unaware those paths had been laid out ahead of them. Mother's Milk stepped back slightly, running a hand over his face as if trying to wake himself from a dream. Huey leaned against the wall, eyes unfocused, trying to hold on to something solid. The front windows rattled suddenly as a loud voice outside called for the occupants to come out peacefully. Federal agents had formed a perimeter, and Homelander floated above them like a silent overseer. Cameras pointed upward at him while microphones extended toward the building, capturing every second for live broadcast. The situation had escalated into a spectacle without anyone inside realizing how it had happened. Butcher walked to the window and looked down at the crowd, seeing how large the response had become. He hadn't called for this. He hadn't triggered this. Yet here it was, the full weight of authority surrounding them because of a man they had met less than a day ago. He turned back to Aizen with a look that was no longer angry or confused, but resigned. Aizen stood slowly and walked toward the center of the room, speaking gently about how systems react when something they don't understand appears in their view. He noted how predictable the response had been from Vought, from the government, from Homelander himself. The explanation sounded less like a justification and more like a lecture on inevitability. Butcher realized then that this wasn't a confrontation that had grown out of control. It was the expected result of a chain of events that had been set in motion the moment he stepped into that warehouse. Huey whispered that they needed to leave before this got worse, but none of them moved because they no longer trusted their own sense of timing. Frenchie glanced at the door as if expecting it to change location when he wasn't looking. Mother's Milk watched Aizen, not with hostility, but with a wary respect that bordered on fear. Aizen looked at Butcher and asked whether he still believed he was fighting Vought's system. Butcher didn't answer, because he understood now that he had stepped into a different one entirely. The building creaked softly as people shifted outside, boots on pavement, radios murmuring, cameras whirring with quiet urgency. From the windows, the street looked like a controlled crisis scene, but inside the safe house, the atmosphere felt strangely calm. The boys stood still not because they were trapped, but because motion no longer felt meaningful. Aizen remained at the center of the room, posture relaxed, expression serene, as if the situation had reached a natural conclusion. Butcher walked slowly to the table and set his phone down with deliberate care, no longer searching it for answers. He looked at Aizen with a gaze that had lost anger, suspicion, and even frustration, replaced by a sober understanding that something fundamental had shifted. He asked one final question, not about powers or motives, but about whether any of this could be undone. Aizen replied gently that once perception changes, returning to the previous state is rarely possible. Outside, Homelander's voice boomed through a loudspeaker, ordering everyone inside to come out peacefully. The command sounded confident, authoritative, and completely disconnected from what was actually happening. Cameras broadcast the scene worldwide as commentators speculated about hostage situations and rogue vigilantes. None of them realized that the true event had already happened quietly inside the room. Aizen stepped toward the door and paused, turning back to Butcher with a polite nod. He thanked him for being so informative about this world, as if the entire encounter had been a research visit rather than a confrontation. Butcher didn't stop him, didn't argue, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply watched as Aizen unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. Federal agents lowered their weapons the moment they saw him, their posture shifting from tactical readiness to professional courtesy. Homelander descended slowly to street level, eyes locked on Aizen with an intensity that bordered on suspicion. Aizen greeted him politely, as if meeting an acquaintance for the first time, and the two men stood facing each other under dozens of cameras. Homelander demanded to know what was happening inside the building, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Aizen answered calmly that everything had already been resolved and that there was no danger. The confidence in his tone, combined with the complete lack of visible threat, disarmed the moment before it could escalate. Behind him, the boys stepped out one by one, not restrained, not escorted, simply walking into the street like civilians. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the crowd buzzed with confusion as the scene failed to match the narrative they had expected. Butcher emerged last, looking not defeated but altered in a way that was hard to define. He watched Homelander and Aizen exchange words without fully hearing them, because his thoughts were still turning over the realization that had settled in his mind. He had spent years fighting a system he believed he understood, only to discover that understanding had been fragile all along. The fight hadn't ended. It had been reframed. Aizen walked calmly past Homelander and down the street, disappearing into the crowd without urgency, without resistance. No one stopped him. No one seemed to think they should. The cameras followed him until he was out of sight, then turned back to the confused gathering left behind. In Vought Tower, executives watched the footage in silence, unable to explain why the situation had resolved itself without conflict. Federal agencies filed reports that made perfect sense individually, but didn't align when placed side by side. Homelander stood in the street longer than necessary, staring in the direction Aizen had gone with a feeling he couldn't name. Butcher remained on the sidewalk, looking at the same empty space, knowing with quiet certainty that the world had changed in a way no one else yet understood. Because now he knew something that would never leave him. That the most dangerous power in the world wasn't strength. It was the ability to decide what everyone believed had happened.